That morning, as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the valley, Ahuli awoke to a silence that felt wrong. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, and for a moment she thought she had imagined the emptiness. Then her eyes fell on the scattered remnants of the night before the ceremonial beads that had adorned her hair lay trampled, her wedding dress crumpled like a forgotten promise. Her heart tightened as the truth settled in her. Betrothed, the white man she had trusted had vanished in the night, leaving not just her alone but the honor of her people dangling by a thread. Ahuli, a warrior known across the Apache lands for her strength, courage, and unwavering commitment to her tribe, sat still for a heartbeat, gathering herself. This was no ordinary betrayal. This was a rupture that threatened the delicate balance between her people and the settlers who had cautiously learned to coexist with them. Every decision, every action she had taken to prepare for the union now seemed overshadowed by his cowardice. Her hands clenched the beads, feeling the cold weight of responsibility pressing on her. Outside, the valley lay deceptively calm, yet a trail in the dirt told a different story. Hoofprints, dozens of them, led eastward toward Apache territory, a silent warning that the tribe's warriors were already on the move. The war drums, distant but growing louder, with each heartbeat echoed across the valley, reverberating through the ground beneath her feet. The rhythm carried a message she could not ignore. Judgment was coming, and there would be no turning back. Ahuli rose from the cabin floor, her moccasins stirring dust in the morning light. She'd always been respected for her poise under pressure, but even she felt the sting of betrayal deep in her chest. The man she'd been ready to trust, ready to walk beside as an equal in the marriage that would unite two worlds, had shown the weakness that could ignite chaos. The balance of peace, painstakingly maintained for years, now teetered dangerously on the edge of war. Every instinct in Ahuli's body told her she must act, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. Her people's honor demanded justice, yet she knew that rash decisions could escalate the situation beyond anyone's control. Her eyes scanned the valley, the rising smoke from distant fires, the movement in the brush that hinted at mounted warriors making their approach. She could feel the tension coiling like a rattlesnake beneath her skin. And then, with the war drums growing louder and the first riders cresting the ridge, Ahuli understood that the choice was hers alone. She could wait paralyzed by shock and anger, or she could step forward and face what had come to demand reckoning. This moment, fraught with danger and responsibility, would mark the beginning of her true test, not just of courage, but of leadership wisdom and the ability to protect her people while navigating the fragile bridge between cultures. Ahuli tightened her grip on the remnants of her ceremonial dress and set her jaw. She would not allow fear or betrayal to define her. With every step toward the approaching riders, she began the journey that would test every fiber of her being, setting the stage for the trials and choices that lay ahead. Ahuli's pulse quickened as she watched the first shadows of the warriors emerge over the ridge. The consequences of last night's betrayal settled over her like a thundercloud. It wasn't just her heart that had been broken. It was the honor of the entire Apache people that now teetered on the edge. 17 years of fragile peace between her tribe and the neighboring white settlements, years of careful negotiations of respect and cautious trust, hung in the balance, threatened by the cowardice of one man who had failed to understand what he had promised. The distant war drums grew louder each beat, sending vibrations through the valley and into Ahuli's chest. The approaching riders were led by her father, Chief Dakota, whose weathered face betrayed neither anger nor doubt, only a steadfast determination that spoke of decades of leadership and hard-won respect. At his side rode Kuruk Ahuli's younger brother, a warrior feared across the Apache lands for his skill in battle and his unyielding sense of justice. Their arrival was not merely ceremonial, it was a summons for accountability, a reckoning for the man who had abandoned his vows and endangered the delicate trust between worlds. Ahuli's mind raced as she assessed the situation. 3 paths lay before the man who had fled their camp, He could return and live under Apache law, bound to the customs and responsibilities of marriage to an Apache woman. He could face combat against Kuruk himself, a trial almost certainly ending in death. Or he could refuse both and meet the consequences of cowardice, a path with no mercy. These options were harsh, unyielding, yet they reflected the principles that had guided her people for generations, principles rooted in honor, courage, and communal responsibility. As the warriors drew closer, Arhuli took in the vivid, commanding tableau. Painted faces gleamed in the morning sun, the streaks of red and black war paint, marking each rider's resolve and readiness. Moccasins scuffed the dry earth in rhythm with their approach, tomahawks glinting with deadly promise at their sides. The ceremonial trappings were more than symbolism. They were a statement of identity, a declaration that their values would not be compromised. Each step the riders took reinforced the reality that actions had consequences, and that cowardice could ripple outward to threaten the lives of many, not just those directly involved. Ahuli felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. As a warrior, she understood better than most the cost of failure. This was not a private betrayal. It was a public one that questioned the trustworthiness of outsiders and cast doubt upon the standing of Apache women in leadership and combat. Every eye in the approaching formation seemed to demand action. Every drumbeat echoed the necessity of swift justice. She could see the tension in the men's shoulders, the controlled fury in their eyes, and she knew that her guidance would be essential in ensuring that the resolution honored both law and humanity. The stakes were undeniable. Ahuli realized that what had begun as a personal affront had escalated into a test of leadership, of courage, and of the Apache commitment to protecting their own while navigating the fragile bridge between worlds. Failure, even unintentional, could undo years of peace sowing distrust and inviting violence. Every decision, every measured word and gesture carried the weight of lives beyond her own, a truth that resonated deeply with anyone who understood the obligations of family, community, and legacy. Taking a deep breath, Ahuli straightened her shoulders, letting her gaze sweep across the ridge. The war drums, the painted faces, the rising sun glinting off tomahawks and beadwork. These were the symbols of accountability and justice. She would not shrink from what must be faced. The next moments would define not only the man who had fled, but the honor of her people and the path forward for peace. It was time to step fully into her role as protector, guide, and arbiter, for inaction was a betrayal as grave as the original flight itself. Ahuli watched silently as her betrothed Thomas stood at the edge of the clearing, the weight of the tribe's gaze pressing down on him. Words alone would not suffice. Only action could redeem the betrayal of the night before. She had made it clear to prove his commitment, he would have to survive not as an outsider, but as a participant in the life of the Apache. The challenge was simple in its framing, yet nearly impossible in its execution. 7 days in the wilderness, stripped of possessions and accustomed conveniences, surviving by the methods of her people. He would have to hunt for his own food, gather plants with a knowledge he did not yet possess, build shelters capable of withstanding storms, purify water from streams, and understand the spiritual lessons etched into the land by generations of Apache ancestors. Failure was not an option. Weakness would expose not only his character, but the fragile trust that held together years of peace. From the first morning, Thomas struggled. The sun rose mercilessly, scorching the earth beneath his bare hands, and the dense forest seemed to mock his every step. He tripped over roots, mice-identified edible plants, and could not start a fire. The shadows of towering pines and the cries of distant coyotes filled his ears with a constant reminder of his vulnerability. At night, cold seeped through the thin fabric of his garments, and the rustle of unseen predators made him question whether survival was even possible. Ahuli observed quietly from a distance, her presence both encouragement and judgment, ensuring that every lesson was learned the hard way. Yet, as hours turned to days, a subtle transformation began. Fear, once paralyzing, gave way to resolve. He started to notice the land differently, the angle of the sun, the tracks of rabbits, the scent of water in the underbrush. He learned to gather roots, identify plants that could heal as well as feed, and to construct makeshift shelters that kept him dry through rainstorms. Each success, small though it was, became a step toward understanding the responsibility he had abandoned the night of the wedding. Ahuli could see the change in his posture, the way he moved with care instead of haste, how his eyes began to scan for signs of danger as well as opportunity. More importantly, he began to understand that survival was more than a test of physical endurance. It was a lesson in humility, respect, and cultural responsibility. He learned to honor the spirits of the land, to recognize that the power of the Apache was not in weapons alone, but in the knowledge passed down through generations, in the patience and observation that connected a warrior to the natural world. The nights were the hardest. Thomas would sit by a small fire, fingers blistered from friction-started flames, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. The stars above reminded him of his smallness, yet each day he returned to the task with more determination. Ahuli noticed his eyes holding a new focus, a seriousness born from accountability. The man who had fled his vows now fought not for himself, but for the honor of the woman he had wronged, and for the peace that hung precariously between peoples. By the 6th day, he had built snares, purified water, using traditional methods, and even crafted a small prayer stick etched with symbols he had painstakingly learned from Ahuli's guidance. It was imperfect, yet it reflected a mind reshaped by respect and effort. Each task completed was more than survival. It was proof of transformation, of willingness to embrace a culture that was not his own, and of a recognition that honor could not be claimed through words alone. As the 7th day approached, Thomas's confidence had grown, but so had the stakes. Ahuli knew that the tribal council would not accept half measures. His actions over the past week would be judged, and his understanding of Apache ways would determine whether the peace they had worked to protect would endure. The trial had tested his body, his mind, and his heart, and the next step would reveal whether he had truly become capable of honoring the trust he had once betrayed. Ahuli's gaze held both expectation and caution. The man who entered the wilderness 7 days earlier was not the same one who had fled. Now, every decision, every demonstration of skill would determine the next chapter, not just for him, but for the fragile alliance that had taken decades to build. The trial had forged a bridge, and the council would soon see if it was strong enough to bear the weight of redemption. The sun had climbed high in the sky when Ahuli led Thomas to the heart of the Apache camp. The clearing had been prepared for judgment, a circle of seasoned warriors and 12 elders seated with solemn authority. The air was thick with expectation. Every eye followed Thomas's every step. The man who had fled the night of the wedding now faced a trial not of words, but of deeds, a final reckoning that would determine not only his fate, but the fragile peace between his people and the Apache. Ahuli's presence beside him was both reassurance and reminder. She had guided him through the harsh wilderness, but now the responsibility rested squarely on his shoulders. The elders' faces, lined with decades of experience, betrayed no emotion, yet their silent scrutiny was enough to make the hair on his neck stand on end. He would have to demonstrate everything he had learned, the skills, the knowledge, and above all the integrity he had so flagrantly abandoned. First came the survival tasks. Thomas knelt on the dirt and began to assemble a shelter from branches, and leaves his hand steady now, his mind focused. Each knot tied, each reed placed, was observed and judged. The elders watched for efficiency, for understanding of the natural order, for respect toward the land that had sustained generations of Apache. Next came the snares he had constructed to catch rabbits and small game. With care, he demonstrated how to bait and check them, explaining the reasoning behind each step. It was not enough to succeed. He had to show awareness of the traditions, the patience, and the respect that these methods embodied. As Thomas worked, Ahuli explained to the gathered tribe the deeper lessons he had absorbed. He had learned to interpret tracks, to recognize plants that could heal as well as feed, and to treat the wilderness not as a foe to be conquered, but as a teacher to be honored. Then the final and most personal demonstration, a prayer stick carefully carved with symbols he had learned over the week, representing his understanding of the tribe's spiritual and cultural heritage. Thomas placed it before the council, his hand's steady heart pounding with anticipation. The tension in the clearing was palpable. Every warrior, every elder measured the sincerity behind his actions. A single misstep could unravel the week's hard-won transformation. Thomas felt the weight of not just his own honor, but of the peace that 17 years of diplomacy had preserved. He saw in their eyes the power of trust, the expectation that courage was proven through action, not empty promises. Minutes stretched like hours as the elders whispered among themselves, assessing every gesture, every movement, every sign of understanding. Thomas's muscles ached, his mind raced, yet he remained composed. The trial demanded more than skill. It required respect, humility, and the ability to endure scrutiny without faltering. Ahuli watched closely, seeing in him the transformation from a man who had fled responsibility to one who stood accountable before an entire people. Then a slow nod from Chief Dakota, followed by a murmur of approval from the council, signaled the verdict. Thomas had succeeded not merely in survival, but in demonstrating a commitment to the principles that governed the Apache way of life. Relief, tempered by exhaustion, flooded him as he realized the trial was over. The elders rose, acknowledging his efforts, and the warriors relaxed their stance, a collective exhale that spoke of both respect earned and peace preserved. Ahuli stepped forward, her expression a mixture of stern approval and cautious hope. The man beside her was no longer a stranger to her culture, nor a coward fleeing from obligation. He had proven through action what words alone could not convey, that honor, courage, and accountability were the true measures of a person. The peace between their peoples remained intact, reinforced by his visible dedication. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Courage was not declared, it was demonstrated. Responsibility could not be spoken into existence. It had to be lived. And the strength of one's word was only as good as the actions that followed it. Ahuli's eyes met Thomas's, conveying what no speech could: respect, trust, and the fragile promise of redemption fulfilled. The trial, complete the path to the next chapter of their story, was set, leading naturally into the lessons, reflections, and final resolutions that would define not just their lives, but the enduring legacy of honor, duty, and action that would guide the tribe for generations to come. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, as Ahuli and Thomas stood together in the center of the Apache camp. The circle of warriors and elders, once a tribunal of judgment, now formed a silent witness to transformation. What had begun as a night of betrayal had evolved into a story of courage, redemption, and enduring commitment. Thomas, once a man who fled responsibility, had emerged through the crucible of 7 days in the wilderness as someone who understood the weight of honor and the responsibilities it carried. Ahuli's gaze swept over the assembled tribe. She could see the subtle shifts in their expressions: approval, cautious hope, and most importantly, respect. Her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride, not only for the man beside her, but for the strength of her people, who had upheld their traditions and values even in the face of potential chaos. The trial had been more than a test of Thomas's abilities. It had reaffirmed the principles that had guided the Apache for generations. Honor was earned through action, courage measured by deeds, and responsibility extended beyond the self to the entire community. From the initial betrayal to the harrowing days in the wilderness, the lessons were clear and profound. Personal cowardice can ripple outward, damaging relationships, endangering lives, and threatening the peace painstakingly built over decades. Conversely, deliberate action grounded in humility and respect can heal wounds, restore trust, and preserve harmony. Thomas's journey demonstrated that courage is not a single heroic moment, but a sustained commitment to do what is right, even when it demands sacrifice. As they stood together, Ahuli saw the transformation not only in Thomas, but in the way the tribe regarded him. His hands bore the calluses of labor, evidence of nights spent learning to live in accordance with Apache ways. His eyes reflected understanding, empathy, and a newfound reverence for the land and the people who had welcomed him, cautiously then challenged him rigorously. He had learned that belonging was earned through respect for culture, adherence to principle, and actions that spoke louder than words. The broader lesson extended beyond the individual. For the tribe, it was a reaffirmation of their values, the importance of accountability, the necessity of vigilance in preserving honor, and the enduring strength of tradition as a guide for decision-making and leadership. For Thomas and for any who witnessed the story, the realization was equally vital. Commitment, integrity, and courage have the power to influence not only personal destiny, but the fate of entire communities. These truths resonate deeply for anyone who has felt the weight of family legacy and moral obligation. Ahuli's eyes met Thomas's one final time, a silent acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. Their union, now grounded in mutual respect and shared responsibility, symbolized more than marriage. It represented the bridge between two worlds, a promise that understanding and honor could span even the widest cultural divides. The peace between the Apache and the surrounding settlements remained intact, strengthened by the proof that commitments once honored through action can endure trials that seem insurmountable. For the audience, particularly those seasoned by life's own trials, the story carries lessons that extend far beyond the confines of this valley. It speaks to the importance of standing by one's word, embracing responsibility, even when inconvenient, and recognizing that true courage is often quiet, persistent, and measured. It reminds viewers that the bonds of family, the respect of community, and the preservation of honor are not abstract ideals. They are living, breathing forces that shape the course of life and the legacy we leave behind. As the firelight began to glimmer across the camp, Ahuli's voice, calm yet firm, might have echoed these truths to any who listened: that life demands accountability, that actions define character, and that courage is demonstrated through consistent choices, not fleeting declarations. And so, for those of you watching, now consider this story a reminder. The measure of a person is not in what they claim, but in what they do when confronted with the hardest choices. If the journey of Ahuli and those around her inspired you, then the next step is simple: follow, share, like, and comment. Join us at Epic Western Stories as we explore more tales of the frontier stories, where honor, justice, courage, and human spirit collide in ways that challenge, teach, and move us.